Welcome to the channel. So as you can see from this first image here, the topic I want to cover today is really why capitalism sucks, or at least why people think capitalism sucks. So today there's a lot of great reasons to think that whatever system we have in place is just not working. We're seeing it in pop culture, we're seeing it in academic circles, we're hearing it on the news. There are all sorts of societal problems that seem to be deeply wrapped up in our economic system. We have racial justice issues all around the world, especially in the United States. We're taking steps to try and control and reverse climate change, and it seems like capitalism is very against climate change, even as an idea, and continues to dump on the climate and release pollutants and whatnot. We're trying to address growing inequality, which seems to be resulting from this division between capital and labor. So capitalism is really getting a very bad rap these days. In this video, I want to go through why I think people believe that capitalism sucks today, and then what I see actually happening under the hood in our economy and in our political system that's leading to these thoughts of capitalism being terrible, and then what we can do about it and what you as an individual can do about it as well to help yourself, help your family, help your loved ones. So I just want to show this comic really quick because I love this. It really encapsulates this growing belief from all parts of the world, really, that capitalism isn't working and that it needs to be reformed or replaced entirely with some new system that's maybe closer to socialism or communism. So I'll just leave that up there for a second. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders, which really rips on capitalists for only caring about a number, only caring about a specific stakeholder in their business and not the larger world, their workers, employees, the climate, and so on and so forth. So before we get into why people care about capitalism and are starting to say that it's terrible, we need to actually define what capitalism is. So I pulled two quick definitions from authoritative sources. One is Wikipedia, one is Merriam-Webster. So Wikipedia says that capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. In a capitalist market economy, decision-making and investments are determined by every owner of wealth, property, or production ability in capital and financial markets, whereas prices and the distribution of goods and services are mainly determined by competition in those markets. Merriam-Webster says that capitalism is an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decisions, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. So really the TLDR of both of these is there's a system of private ownership where people can own goods, own their own ability to produce things, and then they can also own the fruits of their labor. So when they produce things or make an investment, they own the payoff of that labor or those investments. Both of these definitions have quite a lot of jargon though, so I want to break them down a little bit more and present what capitalism ideally achieves for people and for the world. So ideally, this system of private ownership and prices and markets does a couple of things for us. So one, it spurs productive investment and innovation. So by allowing individuals to invest their capital to increase productivity, so both their labor as well as their ideas and connections and all these other things that they have, the money that they may have, they can build machines to make work more efficient so that they can create more food, they can create more goods, and do all of that more easily and therefore sell those things more cheaply. So by allowing people to keep what they sow, basically, you create an incentive for them to invest and to innovate. Capitalism also rewards people in accordance with the value that they create for others. So by allowing individuals to own the fruits of their labor, people are rewarded for creating more, doing more, being more ingenious, and putting in more labor and ingenuity and ideas towards creating value for others. So there's an aligned incentive there. The more value that you create for others, the more profit that you make, the more profit that you capture, the wealthier you get. Capitalism also ideally lowers prices for goods. So by allowing people to compete to produce different goods and services, you allow all of this investment in innovation to create new ways of producing things more efficiently, and that should lower prices for goods. So goods not only become lower in terms of like the dollars that you're using of their currency, but lowering prices also means that it is cheaper and easier and requires less time and resources to create valuable things. So capitalism creates this competition and this market that then allows for goods and services to have their prices consistently lowered through that competition. And finally, capitalism ideally increases freedom and opportunity for everyone because it allows individuals to make their own choices about how they use their own capital and their own labor. So a lot of those definitions that you'll find out there, they focus on the capitalist who owns capital. And you might think, well, I'm not a capitalist. I don't own a factory. I don't own, a $2 million investment account. I don't have all of these pieces of capital. But capitalism is not about you owning a factory necessarily. Everyone has their own capital. Your brain is your own capital. Your labor is your own capital. And you can use that to then create opportunities to create value for other people and grow your wealth and other material things that we think of as the winning, the pot of capitalism that people want to win. So ideally, capitalism allows everyone to use those resources that they have from their $10 million bank account and their factory all the way down to their brain and their ideas, and incentivizes them to use those things to create value for others because they can own the fruits of that labor. So me making this YouTube channel, for example, this is me using my time and my brain to create ideas, to put in the time to create these slides, to create these videos, hoping that people will enjoy them, will follow me, will watch more of this content, and that I can turn that into some sort of profit-making endeavor, basically. However, capitalism can break down. So these things can come under fire and be at risk if there are not strong property rights and if there are high returns to violence. So you need to have really strong property rights so people's individual property is protected. If you have a factory, that factory is at low risk of being invaded by a neighboring town and taken over. So that's strong property rights. And then low returns to violence. So by that, I mean most parties should be better off by resolving conflicts non-violently. So in a system where there's very little law and order, capitalism tends to not work too well because raw power matters more than capital and investment in innovation. It doesn't matter if I can spend a bunch of hours creating a new machine. If you can just come over and steal it, I'm probably not going to put that time in to develop that capital. So by having platforms for nonviolent conflict resolution, like court systems that are deemed very fair by all parties, as well as having decentralized raw power. So just having a system where a lot of people have the ability to exert violence on each other, hopefully then people don't. So that's sort of the paradox of mutually assured destruction, which works and doesn't work and is a very controversial topic that I don't want to get into here and that I don't really have strong views on either way because I can see definitely both sides. By having decentralized raw power, you can hopefully create low returns to violence because you're less likely to go steal something from someone else if they have an ability to steal from you or to exert violence on you. So there's lots of ways to create low returns to violence, and that's going to be one of the big things that I talk about in this video. So where capitalism goes wrong is where those property rights and low returns to violence are upended. So the biggest reason that I want to go through in this video for how capitalism goes wrong is when a single group of winners in this capitalist system, so people who have been successful at amassing capital, at deploying it effectively, and at growing their capital, when those people are able to centrally control violence, or just the threat of it at a very large scale, then they can get a better return from using violence. So this nulls that idea of capitalism does well when there's low returns to violence. This annuls that. This means that this group of winners can then use their control of violence to rig the system so that the system always works out in their favor. So this seems to happen in cycles throughout history, which I'll talk about later. When wealth inequality gets too high, when this group of winners is using violence basically to control the system and to get more and more wealth for themselves at the expense of everyone else, this usually creates a situation where there's a revolution, either violent or nonviolent, which breaks up the vice grip of the current winners of that system and resets the system, hopefully to a place where there's greater opportunity for all. So what do I mean by centralized control of violence? This is kind of an abstract idea. We don't really think of having control over violence in our daily lives. So to make it more concrete, we need to think of who controls the ability to exert violence today. Who do we believe in our daily lives is allowed to be violent? One group that is coming under fire recently, but for a long time we've given the ability to exert violence, is police. Another is the military. We allow these and condone these entities to exert violence on other people. And both of those entities that we've given the power to exert violence, we've given them weapons. In a lot of countries, civilians have even given up their weapons and said only the police and the military are allowed to have weapons. Civilians should not have, say, guns, for example. I use the term weapons, but I'm really talking about guns, assault rifles, pistols are usually what comes under fire here, not kitchen knives and whatnot, even though those are weapons. We give that power to governments today. So governments have this central control of raw power and the ability to exert violence. They have a monopoly on violence in most places in the modern world. So police forces and governments are allowed to use this violence. And this isn't to say this is a negative thing necessarily in all cases. Governments often use this very effectively to lock up people who we all consider to be doing really nasty things, people who are killing other people, stealing things, doing all sorts of violent and horrible acts that we want to discourage and that we consider negative. And I consider that great. You probably consider that great. However, they also use this power of violence to consolidate their own power over the rest of their citizens. So a great example is when someone doesn't pay taxes. When someone doesn't pay taxes, they're either fined or imprisoned. And that is enforced violently, right? Someone will arrest you and hold you against your will and put you in a cell for not doing that. This is a way in which the government enforces its own power over citizens by using violence. Often just the threat of violence is enough to just establish cultural norms that are then followed without even thinking. So I bet you don't think when you're doing your taxes, oh boy, I hope I stay out of jail this year. You just fill out your taxes because that's what you do every year and that's what everyone around you does every year. So it's not something we really think about or consider, but if you sit down and consider, why do I pay my taxes and what would happen if I didn't? At some point you will run into, there's this backstop of violence, that a government is able to exert violence on its people, that makes you pay taxes. So, to understand if capitalism is really at fault today for all the issues that we're seeing, we need to understand if there is a group of winners that is able to centrally control violence at a large scale. So, we're seeing all these problems in our system today, in our capitalist system: rising inequality, subjugated classes with no prospect of upward mobility, stagnant wages, radical politics. Is there a group of winners that is centrally controlling violence at a large scale? So I want to present to you the case that yes, there is a winner, a group of winners today. And I think you probably believe there's a group of winners as well. You may define it slightly differently than me. So I'm going to define that group here and break it down for you. So in most of the developed world today, the group that I see winning is politicians and financiers. They're winning most of the time around every corner. So even this year, when we had the coronavirus crash, one of the biggest crashes in the last century, financiers and politicians continued to be able to win in this system. So this screenshot that I have in the background is a great snapshot from Jim Cramer's Mad Money show that just shows this juxtaposition. So while 16 million Americans have lost jobs in 3 weeks, some of the biggest job shocks since the Great Depression, the Dow is having its best week in a century. And this really speaks to that division between two classes. So the people who are involved in the financial system are able to win. And those people are the people who have this very specific yet incredibly strong power, which is known as the money printer. So not often covered in American history or in economic history is the evolution of our monetary system from sound money to fiat money. So before 1971, most of the world ran on a gold standard through different means, but our money was gold and it was scarce. Nobody can create gold out of thin air. Since 1971, the globe has had what I'll call a fiat currency system. So this means that our currency is not backed by anything scarce like gold, but instead there is a central bank and commercial banks that can create more of this currency at will anytime they like. So we're told that this is done so that the central bank can regulate this wild free market that without them would just go bonkers and would ruin everybody's lives. But in fact, the intervention of central banks is actually creating worse crashes and bigger booms and accelerating and accentuating the market fluctuations. So it might seem like I deviated quite a lot from my last point about centrally controlling violence. So how are these winners, these financiers and politicians, using violence to get this power to print money? Violence comes into the picture because fiat currency keeps its value as a result of, one, coercion to use it, and two, punishment if you try to make it yourself. So first and foremost, we must pay our taxes using the fiat currency of our government. So if we don't pay our taxes, the government uses violence to imprison us. So violence backstops those tax payments. Those tax payments in turn help to prop up the value of the currency, and that allows financiers and politicians to use that money printer and allocate capital as they see fit. And then there's the question of who can create money, right? So financiers and politicians and bankers, they can literally create money out of thin air, writing blank checks, taking on government debt, and monetizing that through the central bank. But if you or I try to print money for ourselves, we're immediately thrown in jail for a long time. So the government can print whenever they want in order to finance deficit spending, but individual citizens are not given that power. So we've given this skewed power to our politicians and to bankers that with a few keystrokes, they're able to spend money. And the important part here about being able to control this money printer is it essentially gives politicians and bankers blank checks. So whereas you and I need to draw our spending off of money that we've earned, politicians and bankers have the power to create money and therefore the power to pick winners and losers in the economy. This means those who are most well connected to the government and to the financial system now have an edge over those who are not. This rigs the system to benefit those who were already ahead in it and uses the organized violence of the government to keep perpetuating that injustice. So as long as the monetary system is propped up by the violence of the government, the people who right now have the ability to create money from thin air and to spend that money to decide where that money goes, whether that's a government budget or lending from a bank, they have the power to pick the winners and losers. So knowing this chain here that I've walked through, centralized control of violence led to centralized control of money, which is leading to central planning of the economy, we can see that there's some irony in how people believe capitalism is going wrong these days. It's not so much capitalism that's going wrong, but it's the conditions that make capitalism work well. We've allowed centralized control of violence by governments to take over, and that has led to centralized control of money by politicians and bankers. And what is central planning of the economy? Well, we know that as socialism. The more central planning you have in the economy, the more socialism there is in that economy. So to understand if this is actually what's happening, if all of these ills that we're seeing in society, this rising inequality, all of that is happening over the backdrop of increasing capitalism, or is it happening over the backdrop of increasing socialism? To understand that, we can look at something simple, which is a GDP formula. So the gross domestic product of a company is a good way to understand who or what is driving an economy. It is a simple summation of consumer spending, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports, which is E minus M there. So socialist countries have very high government spending as a percent of their total GDP, and a very capitalist country would have very low government spending because most of the GDP, most of the productive activity is happening in the background in the private sector, not in the public sector, and not being directed by a government. They're being directed by private entrepreneurs. So I've pulled up data here from the Federal Reserve of the United States' economic database. So this is Federal Reserve numbers. These are government-sanctioned numbers. And all I did was I put total government expenditures over gross domestic product over time. So this shows you what percent of the United States GDP is government spending. And you can see from 1960 to today, it has been on a pretty steady climb. Came back down going into the 2000s, but from 2000 to 2008, it climbed massively, then came back down after the recession as we saw a period of growth. But the most shocking number is 2020. So we can see this rise over time that correlates with all of these issues that we're seeing in inequality and injustice. If we look at 2020, the situation really goes out of control. So this is 2020's number. Coronavirus and associated lockdowns caused GDP to fall quite a bit, but it also caused government spending to rise even more than GDP fell. So today's GDP in the US is over 50% composed of government spending. This screams socialism. So if something isn't working out here, it probably has a lot less to do with capitalism than it has to do with inefficient allocation of resources due to government spending taking over the economy. And then this is just another visualization of the crash in GDP and rise in government spending. That top line is GDP in the United States, that bottom line is government expenditures. And you can see how they've been rising quite a bit. And then in 2020, they just go in a way we've never seen before, straight vertical. It's a shock like this that is cementing socialism as a way of life in the US, while capitalism ends up getting the blame. And it's central planning like this, as we know from many large-scale socialist and communist experiments in the past, central planning is less effective than market mechanisms of price and voluntary exchange at allocating capital efficiently so that people can be more productive. So I know that was a lot of jargon. Let me break it down a little bit. When resources do not go to their most effective uses, everyone loses. There's a breakdown of shared prosperity and more centralization of wealth, usually by those who have the power to allocate capital. So those who are in power in a socialist system, for example, they have the power to allocate capital. And what we usually see over time in every socialist experiment at a large scale, not within families or small groups, but large nation state size socialist experiments, is capital efficiency breaks down. People do not get the things that they need, and there's a loss of overall prosperity. So everyone does worse, except for maybe the people who are in power, who are able to allocate capital, who can allocate it back to themselves, basically. So those people today that can allocate capital in developed economies are those people who can print money. They're the politicians and the bankers in developed countries. They're able to play favorites with those who they like and they prefer. Those are usually the wealthy today. That's why we're seeing these calls for communism and socialism and supporting the working class and rising up against these wealthy people, because the current socialists are playing favorites with the wealthy. In the end, however, calling for socialism in America, it's not changing an unjust system, it's just preferring a different group using that unjust system. It's not solving any injustice. So this might be part of a cycle or a phase that we're going through as a society to swing back to a more free and capitalist system where nobody has control of the money printer or the ability to allocate capital and plan the economy. But what it really is when you're calling for socialism is not to solve the underlying problem. It's just to change who those people say they're helping, basically. By keeping the current system of centralized control of violence and of money creation, what we're risking is a reality where the downtrodden and maligned in society don't actually benefit from the new system. They're simply pandered to instead of given the actual opportunity to thrive. The existing system will undoubtedly continue to enrich the small minority of those who are in power and politically connected, while everyone else, like those people today that are calling for socialism, will end up having to be satisfied with getting just enough concessions to keep them in line. So this is exactly the playbook that we saw play out through the Eastern Bloc and through Soviet Russia and through every socialist experiment, really, on a long enough time scale. What we're left with is a country with some of the widest wealth disparity in the world and most limited freedoms in the world, like we see in Russia today. We don't end up with a system where the people who called for socialism actually do benefit, and maybe they do for 10 years or 20 years, but eventually it breaks down, and the people who are in power who can allocate capital, they take that capital at the expense of everyone else, and they use violence or they use ideology to try and convince everyone else that they deserve to have the power to allocate that capital and that they're going to do it for the benefit of everyone else. I want to try and present a view that this could be part of a larger economic cycle that may play out regardless of what we do, of who we vote for, of what we support. This could be part of this larger cycle of eras of prosperity and freedoms that lead to eras of increasing inequality as a result of centralization of raw power and centralization of the ability to inflict violence, and then to revolution and redistribution of wealth. If you look at a lot of revolutions in the past, the French Revolution is a good example, you see this happening where there was a period of prosperity and freedoms that's usually pretty boring in the history books because there's few wars and people are just doing well and things are getting invented. And then there's this era of low, simmering, increasing inequality and a bit more class conflict. And then you get into revolution and redistribution of wealth, which is what we feel like we're in today. So we're maybe in the era on the right, maybe the era at the bottom. We can have a revolution and redistribute wealth, but we should aim to leave that period of revolution with a system that allows the era of prosperity and freedoms to be really long and fruitful. And that is done by ensuring we have low returns to value and strong property rights. By keeping our existing political and economic system today that's really just socialism guised in the name of capitalism, we risk prolonging the pain of revolution and redistribution and maybe entirely skipping that era of shared prosperity and opportunity for all and going to a new era where the new socialist masters are the ones who have all the wealth and have all the power, and then we lead right into revolution again. So we must push through to a system that gives the individual, the family, the locality, the small units power to self-govern and to interact non-violently with others via the free markets. We'll eventually reach this point in the cycle, but a continuation of the sort of socialist system that we already have in the US would prolong our arrival at that point in the cycle. So this cycle is just one way that you can maybe think about what might be going on right now. This has been helpful for me for trying to understand what's happening in the world today. So how can you prepare? This is something that, given all these thoughts about what is going on, that I've tried to give a lot of thought to. So as far as how you can prepare yourself and your family for this, I'd urge you to consider what a government could take from you to sacrifice, quote unquote, for the common good or to redistribute to the politically favored. Because those are the things that you want to protect. Those are the property rights that you want to make sure that you have. You also want to consider what gives a government the power to control markets and to allocate capital as they see fit. So their weapons are one, and their money and their printing presses. So if you want to retain your individual freedoms, it's important to limit the amount of violence that a government can exert over people, as well as their ability to print money and their ability to keep the value of the money that they use to allocate capital in the ways that they want. Keeping your savings out of the reach of these government redistribution mechanisms and out of the reach of governments, as well as distancing yourself from these controlling socialist governments, can help you weather through this storm, weather through any revolutions that might come. Things like moving abroad, buying gold, buying Bitcoin, these are good things to help you prepare. So I don't want to give any investment advice here or really life advice, because it's up to your individual situation, what makes the most sense for you, for your family, for your loved ones. But you want to be thinking about what is the government going to do next to try and retain power. And if we do go south into a situation where governments become increasingly socialist and increasingly decide the fate of their individual citizens and how they can allocate capital, you want to make sure that you are out of their reach, basically. So if you want to learn more about markets and capitalism, I've put together some resources at the link below, whatismoney.info/markets. That's also in the description below. I've linked on that page to 4 different resources that I consider really foundational for understanding capitalism and markets. And they're things that I never encountered in an economics 101 class. They're kind of hidden gems that no one really talks about today, but they get at really the heart of how markets work, why markets are good at allocating goods and services and at actually creating prosperity for everyone who participates in them. So check that out below. The link is whatismoney.info/markets. And thanks for listening today. Hope you get through these trying times well. Thanks.